We're buying you out. 15 cents on the dollar. Take it or we'll dilute you to nothing. The words came from Jackson Pryor, the man who'd once called himself my partner, my friend, the person who'd shaken my hand in a cramped garage apartment and promised we'd build something revolutionary together. Now he sat across a mahogany conference table in an office we'd furnished together, flanked by our third partner, Elliot Marsh, both wearing matching expressions of calculated cruelty. A charity case, Elliot added, leaning back with practiced disdain. That's what you've always been, Blair. We carried you this far out of loyalty, but this company needs real leadership now, not dead weight with a sympathy stake. The folder they'd slid across the table contained a buyout agreement for $600,000. On my 40% stake in Helix Dynamics, the company I'd co-founded, the company built on technology I'd developed. $600,000 for shares they both knew were worth tens of millions. The conference room felt airless. Outside, the San Francisco skyline stretched toward the bay, the view we'd toasted when we'd signed the lease on this office. That felt like another lifetime, another version of these people who now stared at me like I was something to be managed and discarded. What they didn't know, what their arrogance and their lawyers and their newly inflated egos couldn't conceive, was that the patent underlying every dollar of Helix Dynamics' valuation wasn't in the company's name. It was in mine, solely, legally, irrevocably mine. And they were about to learn exactly what that meant. Before the revelation that changed everything, the story behind it needs context. This channel brings real stories from the moments when trust collapses, when partnerships fracture, and when the truth becomes the most powerful weapon in the room. The first milestone is behind us, and the journey toward 2,000 subscribers continues with each story shared. The subscribe button is there for those who want to be part of this growing community. My name is Blair Hoffman, and at 31 years old, I'd already learned that intelligence and opportunity don't always arrive in the same package. My mother raised 3 kids on a respiratory therapist's salary after my father decided family life wasn't compatible with his other interests. We didn't go hungry, but we understood math in a way comfortable people never do. The calculation of whether we could afford both the field trip fee and new shoes, whether the heat stayed at 65 or 68, whether the slightly cheaper grocery store was worth the bus fare to get there. Mom never complained. She worked her shifts, helped with homework, and treated every person with the same respect, whether they were surgeons or janitors. She'd say that everyone's carrying something heavy, and kindness costs nothing. That shaped how I moved through the world. Not with bitterness about what I didn't have, but with awareness of what others might be experiencing. Empathy isn't about pity. It's about recognition. Seeing people clearly, understanding their motivations, reading the room. That skill turned out to be useful in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd put myself through UC Berkeley on scholarships, loans, and a rotation of jobs that kept my sleep schedule perpetually chaotic. Graduated with degrees in biomedical engineering and materials science, then landed in a research position at a medical device company developing next-generation prosthetics. The work was fascinating. The corporate environment was suffocating. Every innovation required 17 approval layers. Every experiment needed justification in triplicate. The gap between what we could do and what we were allowed to try felt like working with handcuffs on. By 27, I'd started side projects. Evenings and weekends, I'd been exploring adaptive neural interface materials, substances that could respond to electrical impulses from nerve tissue, potentially creating prosthetics with genuine sensory feedback. Not just mechanical replacement limbs, but devices that could feel, that could integrate with the body's actual nervous system. The implications were staggering. The science was years ahead of anything in commercial development. And I was doing it in a 1-bedroom apartment with equipment I'd built from salvaged components and student-grade materials purchased on a budget that would have made my corporate colleagues laugh. That's where Jackson found me. Jackson Pryor had the pedigree I lacked. Stanford MBA, venture capital connections, family money that provided both investment capital and social access. He'd been researching the prosthetics market, looking for emerging technologies worth building a company around, when a mutual acquaintance mentioned my work. He'd shown up at my apartment on a Tuesday evening, all calculated casual in expensive jeans and a button-down, looking around my cramped lab setup with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're really doing neural interface research here?" he'd asked, picking up one of my prototype sensors. "This is graduate-level stuff. Why aren't you at a university lab?" "University labs move slow and publish everything," I'd replied. "I'm not ready to publish. I'm ready to build something real." That had sparked his interest. Over the next 3 hours, I'd walked him through my research, the conductive polymer composites I'd developed, the signal processing algorithms that could interpret nerve impulses, the theoretical framework for creating genuine sensory integration. Jackson had listened with an intensity that felt validating. Finally, someone who understood the magnitude of what this could become. "This could be worth hundreds of millions," he'd said as he was leaving. "But you can't develop it alone. You need infrastructure, funding, regulatory expertise. You need a company." "I need to maintain control of my research," I'd countered. "I've seen what happens when corporations swallow innovations and bury them in development hell." "What if you were the corporation?" he'd asked. "Co-founder, significant equity stake, decision-making authority. I bring the business infrastructure and funding connections. You bring the technology that makes it all worth building." The idea had been intoxicating. My research, freed from both corporate bureaucracy and my apartment's limitations. Real resources, real timeline, real impact. We'd spent the next month hammering out terms. Jackson wanted to bring in Elliot Marsh, his former roommate from Stanford who'd been working in medical device sales and understood the commercial side of the healthcare market. The three of us would split the company. Jackson and Elliot would each hold 30%. I'd hold 40% as the technical founder. It seemed fair. I had the core technology. They had the business expertise and industry connections. The lawyers had drawn up partnership agreements, operating contracts, equity structures, and everything formal and proper, notarized and filed. What I'd done separately, on advice from a law school friend who'd helped me pro bono, was file the core patents in my individual name before the partnership formed. The neural interface materials, the signal processing innovations, the integration protocols, all of it protected under patents listing Blair Hoffman as the sole inventor. Helix Dynamics would license the technology from me. Exclusive license, generous terms, built to support the company's growth. But license, not ownership. My friend had explained it simply. Your invention, your protection. The company can use it, build on it, make money from it. But if anything happens to the partnership, you keep control of the core IP. At the time, it had felt like paranoid over caution. Jackson and Elliot were my partners, my team. We were building something together. I'd filed the patents anyway. The first 2 years of Helix Dynamics were exactly what I'd hoped for. We'd raised seed funding, then a Series A round that brought in $12 million in capital, built out a proper lab, hired a small team of brilliant engineers and researchers, started clinical trials for our first product, a prosthetic hand with genuine tactile sensation. The test results were extraordinary. Patients could feel texture, temperature, pressure. A woman who'd lost her hand in an industrial accident had cried when she felt her daughter's face for the first time in 6 years. A veteran could handle eggs without breaking them, feel the weight of his son's baseball glove, experience handshakes instead of just performing them. The media coverage had been overwhelming. TED Talk invitations, shine profiles in medical journals, interest from major prosthetics manufacturers who wanted to license our technology. Our valuation had climbed from $12 million to $40 million, to estimates approaching $200 million as we approached FDA approval. Jackson and Elliot were fielding acquisition offers monthly. My 40% stake, on paper, was worth $80 million. I'd moved out of my apartment into a modest house, paid off my student loans and my mother's mortgage, started sleeping regular hours for the first time in years. The work remained extraordinary. Every breakthrough felt like science fiction becoming reality. Every clinical success reminded me why this mattered more than money or valuation. But the relationship with Jackson and Elliot had started shifting. Small things initially, conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, strategy meetings I wasn't included in, hiring decisions made without my input, even for technical positions. Jackson had started introducing me at investor meetings as our technical specialist rather than co-founder. Elliot had begun framing decisions as the business side versus the research side, positioning my input as narrow expertise rather than leadership perspective. When I'd raised concerns, Jackson had been smoothly dismissive. "You're overthinking it, Blair. Everyone knows you're essential to this company. But investors want to see business leadership, not lab coats. It's just optics." The rationalization had been plausible enough that I'd accepted it, and stayed focused on the research, the clinical trials, the actual work that mattered. Meanwhile, they'd been planning. The signs became impossible to ignore after we'd closed our Series B funding round. $40 million at a pre-money valuation of $160 million. My stake was now worth $80 million on paper, theirs $60 million each. That's when the organizational restructuring began. Jackson had brought in a new CFO, a sharp-edged woman named Kathleen Winters, who'd immediately started optimizing operational efficiency. New approval workflows that routed through Jackson and Elliot. Modified signature authorities that reduced my financial oversight. Restructured committees that diluted my voting power on key decisions. All presented as professional maturation. Near the company growing up from scrappy startup to serious business. I'd pushed back on some of it, but the framing was always the same. Standard corporate governance, investor expectations, fiduciary responsibility. Question it too hard, and suddenly I was being defensive, territorial, unable to scale with the company's growth. The real warning came from our head of engineering, a brilliant woman named Cassidy Park, who'd been with us from the early days. She'd caught me after a team meeting, kept her voice carefully neutral. "Blair, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise you won't reveal I told you." My stomach had dropped. "What's going on?" "Jackson and Elliot have been meeting with Whitmore Medical. Not about partnership or licensing, about acquisition. And the terms they're discussing, they're structured to minimize your payout." Whitmore Medical was one of the major players who'd been circling us for months. Deep pockets, established distribution, everything needed to scale our technology globally. "How would they minimize my payout?" I'd asked. "I own 40%. Cassidy had hesitated. "The structure they're proposing treats the patents as company assets. You'd get your equity percentage of the company's sale, but the patent value would be calculated separately and allocated based on some formula Kathleen developed. From what I overheard, it would reduce your effective payout by 60 or 70%. "The patents aren't company assets," I'd said slowly. "They're licensed to the company. I own them individually." Her expression had shifted to confused relief. "No, then you're protected. But Blair, they don't think you know that. I've heard Jackson refer to managing Blair's expectations and addressing the technical founder problem. Whatever they're planning, it's not friendly." I'd spent the next week moving carefully. Confirmed with my attorney that the patents were properly filed and the licensing agreements were airtight. Reviewed every company document I could access, looking for angles I'd missed. What I'd found was worse than I'd imagined. They'd been preparing a dilution strategy, issuing new shares under terms that would have reduced my stake from 40% to roughly 15%. The authorization was buried in corporate governance provisions I'd signed years ago. language I hadn't fully understood at the time. They'd also been developing a narrative. And I'd found draft presentations on Jackson's accidentally shared cloud folder, materials for the board positioning me as technically brilliant but strategically limited, unable to scale with leadership demands, a risk factor for acquisition negotiations. The framing was insidious. Nothing overtly false, just selective emphasis and careful innuendo. Blair's great at research but doesn't understand commercial realities. Blair's attached to the technology in ways that might complicate strategic pivots. Blair's equity stake is disproportionate to current contributions. Death by 1,000 implications, building a case for pushing me out. The meeting had been scheduled with 24 hours notice. Urgent, strategic discussion with just the three founders. I'd known before I walked in what was coming. Jackson and Elliot had been waiting in the conference room, the buyout folder already on the table like a prop in a rehearsed scene. The offer had been insulting, 15 cents on the dollar, framed as generosity. The company's moving in new directions, Jackson had said with practiced sympathy. Your contributions have been valuable, but the leadership team needs different expertise now. This offer lets you exit with dignity and capital to pursue other interests. $600,000 for an $80 million stake, I'd said flatly. You're calling that generous? Elliot had leaned forward, dropping the sympathetic pretense. We're calling it realistic. That $80 million is paper value based on technology you developed on company time, with company resources as part of company operations. The actual value of your contribution, separate from the infrastructure Jackson and I built, is significantly lower. A charity case, he'd added, the phrase clearly workshopped for maximum impact. That's what you've always been, Blair. We carried you this far out of loyalty. But this company needs real leadership now, not dead weight with a sympathy stake. The character assassination was almost impressive in its efficiency. Rewrite the entire history, erase my contributions, reduce years of partnership to patronizing charity. Jackson had slid the folder closer. Sign today and we can make this clean. Refuse and we move forward with dilution and restructuring. Either way, your role here is ending. The only question is whether you leave with something or nothing. The rage that moved through me wasn't hot. It was ice cold and perfectly clear. 3 years. I'd spent 3 years trusting these people, building alongside them, believing in shared purpose and mutual respect. And they'd been planning to rob me the moment it became convenient. I'd pulled out my phone, opened my document folder, and placed it on the table between us. Before I respond to your offer, I'd said quietly, I want to make sure we're working from accurate information. You mentioned technology developed on company time with company resources. Let's clarify that. I'd pulled up the first patent. This is the core neural interface polymer composition. Patent filed 14 months before Helix Dynamics was incorporated. A sole inventor, Blair Hoffman, pulled up the second. Signal processing algorithms for nerve impulse interpretation, filed 11 months before incorporation. Sole inventor, Blair Hoffman. The third. Integration protocols for sensory feedback systems, filed 8 months before incorporation. Sole inventor, Blair Hoffman. I'd looked up at their faces. Jackson had gone pale. Elliot was staring at the screen like it was a venomous snake. Every core patent underlying Helix Dynamics technology, I'd continued, is filed in my individual name. The company holds an exclusive license to use this technology, licensed from me under terms we negotiated when the partnership formed. Terms that include royalty provisions if I'm ever forced out or if the company is sold without my consent. That's not, Jackson had started. It's documented, I'd interrupted. Filed with the patent office, referenced in our original operating agreement that your lawyers drafted and you both signed. The company has exclusive use as long as I remain an equal partner with appropriate decision-making authority. Termination of that partnership status reverts licensing terms to standard commercial rates. Elliot had found his voice. You can't hold the company hostage like this. Those patents should be company property. You developed them for company purposes. I developed them in my apartment with my equipment before this company existed, I'd corrected. Then I licensed them to our partnership under favorable terms. Terms you're now violating by attempting to force me out. Jackson had been scanning his phone, presumably checking with the lawyers. His expression confirmed what I already knew. I was right. They were trapped, and the power dynamic had just inverted completely. What do you want? He'd asked finally. I want my 40% stake respected. I want equal partnership authority restored. I want Kathleen Winters and her dilution schemes gone by end of week. And I want both of you to understand that if you ever attempt something like this again, I'll revoke the favorable licensing terms and charge Helix Dynamics market rate royalties retroactively from inception. The number I'd run with my attorney, approximately $60 million in royalties owed based on company valuation and standard medical device patent licensing rates. It would have bankrupted Helix Dynamics and destroyed everything we'd built. But it was legally airtight and entirely within my rights. The next 3 weeks were professionally brutal and personally clarifying. Jackson and Elliot had scrambled to contain the damage. Kathleen had resigned quietly. The dilution plan shelved. The acquisition discussions with Whitmore put on indefinite hold. But the partnership was irretrievably broken. We could maintain professional civility in meetings, but the trust was gone. Every decision became negotiation. Every discussion carried undertones of suspicion. Cassidy had been vindicated and promoted to Chief Technology Officer, a position that should have existed from the beginning. She'd become my ally in what was now effectively a cold war within our own company. The board, once deferential to Jackson's business leadership, had suddenly remembered that the company's entire value proposition depended on patents I controlled. My opinions carried new weight. My votes mattered. The narrative about technical expertise versus business leadership evaporated once everyone understood the actual power structure. But running a company in a state of internal conflict was unsustainable. The innovation that had been Helix's heartbeat started suffering. Clinical trials continued, but new research slowed. The energy that comes from collaborative excitement was replaced by the exhaustion of constant vigilance. I'd started exploring options. The patents were mine, the technology was proven, and I didn't need Jackson or Elliot to continue advancing the work. What I needed was a different kind of partnership. People who valued collaboration over control, who understood that equity meant equity, who wouldn't mistake temporary power for permanent authority. I'd found them at Ashford Biomedical, a mid-sized medical device company with excellent reputation and ethical leadership. Their CEO, Raymond Chen, had approached me months earlier about potential collaboration. At the time, I'd declined, loyal to Helix, to the partnership I'd believed in. Now, I'd scheduled a different conversation. Raymond had met me at a coffee shop in Palo Alto, far from both our offices, appropriately neutral territory. I heard there's been some turbulence at Helix, he'd said carefully. Industry gossip being what it is. My partners attempted to force me out for a fraction of my equity value, I'd replied. They didn't realize I owned the core patents. We've reached a stalemate, but the partnership isn't salvageable. He'd absorbed that with a thoughtful nod. Omar, what are you looking for? Option 1. I leave Helix, revoke their favorable licensing terms, and license the patents to someone else. That bankrupts Helix and frees me to work with a company that values genuine partnership. Nuclear option, Raymond had observed. Effective, but destructive, I'd agreed. It would hurt our employees who did nothing wrong, delay technology that could help thousands of patients, and waste years of development work. I don't want that if there's an alternative. Option 2? Someone acquires Helix under terms that force Jackson and Elliot out, compensate me appropriately for both equity and patent value, and provide a leadership structure where the technology can continue developing. Ashford acquires Helix. I stay on as CTO with significant equity in the combined company. And we scale this technology the way it deserves. Raymond had been quiet for a long moment, clearly running calculations. Jackson and Elliot would fight that acquisition, he'd finally said. They control 60% of voting shares. They control 60% of shares in a company that has no value without my patents. I can make it very clear that any acquisition I don't approve triggers licensing revocation. They can sell the company's desks and coffee machines, but the actual technology walks out with me. That's hardball. That's reality, I'd corrected. The patents are mine. I've been generous in letting Helix use them under favorable terms because I believed in the partnership. That belief was misplaced. And now I'm looking for actual partners who understand that mutual benefit means mutual respect. Raymond had extended his hand across the table. Let me talk to my board. If we can structure this right, I think there's a deal that works for everyone who deserves to benefit. The acquisition negotiation took 4 months and exposed exactly how hollow Jackson and Elliot's business leadership had been. Ashford had made an offer, $180 million for Helix Dynamics, contingent on Blair Hoffman joining as CTO and transferring patent licenses to the merged entity under defined terms. The structure was elegant. Shareholders would receive their percentage of $120 million. The additional $60 million would be paid directly to me as licensing transfer fees for the patents, separate from equity payout. My total compensation, $48 million for equity stake, plus $60 million for patent transfer, $108 million. Jackson's payout, $36 million. Elliot's payout, $36 million. They'd argued it was unfair, that equity should be equity, that the patents should be company property. The board had been unsympathetic. Ashford's offer was the only serious acquisition interest remaining. Word had spread about the internal conflict and the patent ownership structure. No other buyer wanted to navigate the complexity or risk me walking away. The choice was simple. Accept Ashford's terms, or watch Helix Dynamics collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction while I took the patents elsewhere. Jackson had tried one final manipulation. After everything we built together, you're really going to burn it down over ego? The statement had been so perfectly inverted, so completely lacking in self-awareness that I'd almost laughed. You tried to steal my life's work for $600,000, I'd replied quietly. You called me a charity case and dead weight. You spent months planning to erase my contributions and force me out. Don't lecture me about ego or partnership. Sign the papers or don't. But I'm done pretending you deserve more consideration than you've ever shown me. They'd signed. The transaction had closed 6 weeks later. Helix Dynamics became a subsidiary of Ashford Biomedical. I'd joined their leadership team with both resources and authority to continue advancing neural interface technology. Most of Helix's employees, including Cassidy and the core engineering team, had come with me. Jackson and Elliot had their $36 million each and whatever careers they could salvage with reputations for having tried to cheat their technical co-founder. Industry gossip being what it is, the full story had spread quickly. Professional consequences followed them in ways that money couldn't fix. The story could end there. Justice served, betrayal punished, equity restored. But the real lesson runs deeper than one partnership's collapse. Technical founders, particularly those without traditional business pedigree, face this vulnerability constantly. Bring the innovation. Get pushed to the sidelines once the company becomes serious business. Told they don't understand commercial realities, can't scale with leadership demands, need to trust the business side to handle strategic decisions. Sometimes that's legitimate. Technical expertise doesn't automatically translate to management capability or business strategy, but sometimes, often, it's a power play. Rewrite the narrative to diminish contributions. Restructure authority to consolidate control. Wait for the right moment to force out the person who made everything possible. The protection isn't just legal, though proper patent filing and licensing agreements matter enormously. The protection is understanding power dynamics and maintaining leverage. I'd filed those patents separately, not because I'd predicted Jackson and Elliot's betrayal, but because I'd understood a basic principle: protect what's yours before you share it. Make sure generosity comes from choice, not vulnerability. The licensing terms I'd offered Helix had been genuinely favorable. Below market rates, in exclusive access, terms designed to help the company succeed. But they'd been structured so that betrayal had consequences, so that attempting to take what wasn't theirs would cost more than fair partnership. When Jackson and Elliot had tried to force me out, they'd assumed I was powerless. Technical expertise without business control, minority position without voting leverage, contributions too far in the past to maintain current relevance. They'd been wrong on every count because I'd understood something they'd missed. The patents weren't historical contributions. They were ongoing value, fundamental to every product, essential to every future development. And they were mine. 2 years after the acquisition, the work at Ashford had exceeded everything I'd hoped for at Helix. We'd received FDA approval for our first-generation prosthetics, launched second-generation devices with expanded sensory capabilities, started clinical trials on neural interface applications beyond prosthetics, potential treatments for paralysis, sensory disorders, chronic pain conditions. The technology my apartment research had sparked was reaching patients who'd been waiting for exactly this breakthrough. Every success story, people regaining function, independence, connection to their own bodies, validated why the fight had mattered. Raymond had been the partner Jackson had pretended to be: collaborative, respectful, genuinely interested in advancing technology rather than just extracting value from it. We'd disagreed on strategy sometimes, navigated complex decisions together, built something sustainable because it was built on actual mutual benefit. My mother had retired comfortably. I'd endowed a scholarship at UC Berkeley for first-generation college students in biomedical engineering. The money from the acquisition had provided security, but more importantly, it had provided freedom to focus on work that mattered without constant vigilance against betrayal. Jackson and Elliot had landed on their feet financially. 36 million cushions most falls. But their professional reputations carried permanent asterisks. The story of trying to cheat their co-founder followed them. Investors were cautious. Potential partners asked pointed questions. Some mistakes cost more than money. Some betrayals echo longer than bank balances last. If there's wisdom to extract from this experience, it's not cynicism about partnership or paranoia about trust. It's understanding that protection and generosity aren't opposites. Filing patents in my own name before forming Helix wasn't distrust. It was due diligence. Licensing those patents to the company under favorable terms was generosity. Maintaining leverage if that generosity was abused was wisdom. The people who'll betray you rarely announce themselves. They'll speak partnership language while planning power plays. Use collaboration rhetoric while consolidating control. They'll make you question your own perceptions, doubt your value, accept diminishment as professionalism. The defense is documentation, clear agreements, and understanding where actual power resides. Not to wield it cruelly, but to ensure fairness remains mutual. Jackson and Elliot had called me a charity case, dead weight, a technical specialist who needed to step aside for real leadership. They'd believed their business expertise was the company's foundation, and my contributions were interchangeable technical labor. They'd learned otherwise when $60 million in royalty obligations materialized from the patents they'd assumed were theirs to control. The lesson cost them nothing compared to what it could have cost me. 600,000 for 80 million in equity. Permanent diminishment of contributions. Erasure from the story of technology I'd created. They'd rolled the dice on my ignorance or powerlessness. They'd lost because I'd understood something fundamental. Generosity requires protection. Collaboration requires leverage. And trust, without verification, is vulnerability waiting to be exploited. 2. The conference room where Jackson had tried to force me out was renovated when Ashford integrated the offices. Different furniture, different purpose, different energy. The space where I'd been called dead weight was now where our team planned clinical trials that would help thousands of patients. Physical spaces outlast the moments they contain. The mahogany table where betrayal was attempted now hosted collaboration meetings. The office where power plays were schemed became space for genuine innovation. But the memory remains sharp. The moment when partnership revealed itself as performance, when people I'd trusted showed their actual priorities, when the company we'd built together became territory they tried to steal. The smile on my face when they demanded I accept 600,000 and walk away, that hadn't been triumph. It had been recognition. The same recognition I'd felt watching my mother treat everyone with equal respect regardless of their position. Understanding that how people wield power reveals who they actually are. Jackson and Elliot had wielded power through attempted theft, through diminishment, through calculated cruelty. When that power evaporated, when the patents they'd assumed were theirs turned out to be mine, when the leverage they'd thought they held dissolved, when 60 million in royalty obligations appeared, they'd revealed themselves completely. Some people lead through collaboration, others manage through control. The difference becomes obvious when power dynamics shift, and the person they'd underestimated holds all the actual leverage. The patents were always mine. The technology was always my creation. And the generous licensing terms were always my choice to offer. When they tried to take instead of asking, to steal instead of partnering, to erase instead of acknowledging, the choice became equally clear. They could pay market rates. They could face 60 million in royalty obligations. They could sell the company under terms that reflected actual value, actual contributions, actual equity. Or they could have nothing. They'd chosen survival, accepted the acquisition, taken their 36 million each, walked away from the company they'd tried to steal. The technology continues developing. The patients continue benefiting. The work continues mattering. And somewhere, Jackson and Elliot tell a version of this story where they're the victims, where I'm the villain, where their attempted theft becomes somehow justified or misunderstood. That's fine. Let them tell whatever story helps them sleep. The patents are in my name. The royalties were paid. The equity was honored. Reality doesn't negotiate with narrative. And $60 million is the expensive lesson in the difference between position and power, between assumption and truth, between what you think you control and what's actually yours. The journey from garage apartment to medical device innovation wasn't straightforward. The path from partnership to betrayal to justice was harder than the technical challenges ever were. But both journeys taught the same fundamental lesson: protect what matters, document everything, and understand that the most important patents aren't just the legal ones. They're the protections built into every agreement, every structure, every relationship before trust is tested and found wanting. This channel continues sharing these stories as the subscriber count grows toward 2,000. Real experiences from the moments when professional relationships fracture and the outcomes reshape careers. The subscribe button remains available for those interested in these ongoing narratives from the corporate battlefield. Some partnerships end in mutual success. Others end in betrayal and forced resolution. The difference often comes down to who understood power, who documented protection, and who realized too late that the person they'd underestimated held every card that actually mattered.